Stanley, very good morning to you.
Well, good morning to you.
Thank you very much. I've been trying to get you on this show for such a long time, and you're so busy that I haven't managed to do so. But I'm reading your piece in The Independent, in which a lot of people have said it's quite controversial, because not only are you telling Rishi Sunak to stick with his earlier plan, but you're also praising China and their climate change policy. So what exactly is their climate change policy? Well, the climate change policy was very clearly enunciated by the Chinese government in the context of the COP26 summit in Glasgow, which, by the way, as you know, Britain chaired, and it had rather a success, because at the beginning of COP26, very few countries had signed up to a global goal of net zero by 2050. By the end of COP26, well over 90% of countries had signed up to that. Now, China's role was absolutely crucial, and I took the view, you know, even before COP26, and I certainly take it now, that China was making a big effort. At COP26, it became absolutely clear it was going to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Okay, it wasn't 2050, but it was 2060. As far as the peaking of emissions was concerned, it said we're going to do that by 2030. Now, the point about China is it actually does what it's going to. It actually does what it says it's going to do, and that's pretty crucial. I don't want to make any comments here about, as it were, the two-party system. And, you know, that's what we have, and we're happy to have it. But China, you do know, if it says it's going to do something, will do something. And I add on one thing, so I mentioned that in my, as it were, statement, which was picked up by The Independent. I have just spent 8 weeks in China making a film about Marco Polo's progress in the 13th century, and a fascinating historical film that's going to be. But you can't spend 8 weeks in China without realizing that this is a country which is actually dedicated to coming out with the new renewables, making renewables the prime source of its energy, and that is going to get there. There are windmills, wind turbines on every hill and every valley. There are solar panels anywhere you can speak of, and there are more impressive devices up there coming along soon. Yeah. So, but they're still building, are they not, Stanley? Coal-fired power stations at quite a rapid pace. Well, let's look at this. Let's look at this in historical context. Have I got a second here? Well, it depends. If you say yes first, you might have some time to explain. If you agree with me, well, which is obviously the case, right? Right, we know they're building coal-fired power plants, but where are they coming from? They're coming from a situation where there was a very low level of economic development in China over the last 40 years. They have brought up 400 million people to a very, substantial level of economic development, and they know that they will, as it were, continue on that path, and they're committed, as I said, to peaking emissions by 2030. Yes, they're building coal-fired plants, but don't forget, if you look at the historical aspect of this, who created the United Kingdom? Our country was responsible for was the fifth largest emitter of CO2, taking it historically, since the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, but you can't really count that, can you? Where we are because we've done it. Yeah, but you can't really count that. You can't say that we were the biggest polluter in the world when we were the only polluter in the world, because that was the way it was. I mean, I'm sorry that some countries didn't have the technology to actually pollute the world, but you can't blame Britain for being so advanced that it was the only person or the only country more or less polluting the world, right? But you can, Mike, you can ask Britain to have some understanding of countries like India and China who want to get somewhere where we have got. So what we're now at is an international effort to get to the net zero target by 2050. Actually, the intermediate targets are extremely important too, because you can't get to 2050 without getting to 2030. We have in Glasgow a clear commitment. That commitment built on the Paris Commitment of 2015, which said we're not going to allow the increase in global temperature to be more than, ideally, 1.5, but at the very least, not more than 2 degrees Celsius. Now, we're not there. I'm afraid we're not there. And that is why it is fundamentally important. Now, coming to Rishi Sunak, I don't
Well, hang on, you can't come to Rishi Sunak yet because I haven't finished with you on China. You know, the bottom line about China, right, is that I'm not willing to give any quarter to a country which has basically completely and utterly taken over and colonised Africa, completely grabbed all of the mineral rights in almost every country there, same in South America, same in Afghanistan. You know, they don't need any help from Britain to be given a pass to pollute the rest of the world. They're doing just fine, thank you very much indeed. So I think the open market should suggest that we can take a little pause and actually push our net zero commitments to 2060 as well. Thanks very much.
No, Mike, it doesn't work like that at all. It should not work like that. I've heard people say, "Oh, well, we're only 1% of global emissions,"
which is true.
Well, so what? So what? If every country which is only 1% said we're not going to do anything, then nobody would do anything. We are taking.
Which other countries are doing something more than we are?
We are committed and should be committed to joining the collective global effort. And by the way, I have had the honour to be for some years now the international ambassador of the Conservative Environment Network, which pushed very hard indeed for the G7 commitment in Palm Spain in I think it was July 2020, for the G7 to stick firmly to the net zero target of 2050. And we're going to get there. We're going to get there, but we can only get there if we actually do the kind of things which Lord Deben and the Climate Change Committee said we need to do. And yes, it is a massive push on renewables. It has to be done. It's the key way.
And I know that, Stanley, you've always been very consistent on this, and you have been doing this for most of your life, pushing this particular agenda. And for that, I can at least say that you're very, very consistent. But I think a lot of people now are beginning to realise that they do like the idea, but as soon as it's going to start costing them more money, they like it much less. And in fact, you know, the commitments that are being made at these COP26, COP27, COP28 meetings are being made by governments. They're not being made by the people. And the people are not really being asked on a sort of point-by-point basis if this is what they want. And as we saw in Uxbridge, your son's former constituency, when they do get faced with having to pay for it, they don't want it.
Well, Mike, what does that say? What does that say to you? What does that say to you?
Well, it says that people can't afford it. They don't want it. That's what it says.
Well, then politicians have got to do a better job of explaining how vital it is. Now, I would have thought in this summer, when we see the whole world set ablaze, although not necessarily in the UK.
It's all gone out now. That was last week.
Oh, it's raining pretty heavily down here, I can tell you.
In Rhodes, it's 26 degrees today.
Well, where is that, in Rome?
In Rhodes.
I love it.
Yeah, Rhodes at 26, very pleasant.
Well, mind you, 26, how many people would be quite happy with 26 in some time?
Exactly right.
Anyway,
exactly right. This is it.
Coming back to your point, but you absolutely hit the nail on the head.
That's what I do.
You do. Well, you're right. Philosophically and politically, in every possible way, how do you ask for this generation, and in particular a certain segment of this generation, which is the older people who are not going to be so affected by what happens down the line, how do you vote? How do you ask them to vote for something which is actually going to cost them money? It is not easy. Now, you could say, best of all, have a system where government can actually say what it wants and get what it wants done. But actually, it's not best of all, because that means you have diminished democracy, and democracy is the founding stone of everything we do. So what you can say is then we've got to get the word out. We've got to get the word out. We've got to convince the Mike Grahams of this world to stop talking garbage and actually start talking sense.
I talk common sense. This is the home of common sense. You've made the wrong argument there, I'm afraid, because it is well known that I speak not only common sense, but I also speak for the people who don't have a voice. And that's why I'm telling the powers that be, i.e. you, that you have to be careful that you don't overstretch yourself and become too pro-China and not anti-British, because we want to have a decent economy here, which is being kiboshed by the Chinese at every juncture. They're loaning more money to more people in this country and charging them more interest, and I mean that by the banking system. And so, China doesn't need any help from us. And I think we'd be far better off, actually, treating them as what you might regard as a sort of, shall we say, a cautious friend, as opposed to somebody that we should embrace, because you don't know what they're taking out your pocket.
Well, I don't know. I just don't agree with you on this. I think it is fundamentally important now for us to work very closely with China on these key environmental issues. And by the way, do you mind if I mention biodiversity too? I'm speaking from my farm in the heart of Exmoor. China did do a good job when it came to the so-called Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Treaty adopted.
They didn't do such a great job when they gave the world COVID.
Well,
huh?
I've been listening to your program. COVID happened. I think
it came from China, Stanley.
We probably did make a huge mistake in the way we reacted to COVID.
Yes, but it came from China, though.
We'll learn some lessons there. Well, I'm not sure the verdict is 100% out on that, but even if it is...
No, I think it is, actually. We're not sure where exactly in China, but it definitely came from China.
Can I come to one of your points, and that's the point you just mentioned about patriotism? Honestly, I think that is actually pretty good. Pretty good. I think I am being really most patriotic. I think fundamentally patriotic, because I do think it is absolutely desperately in this country's interest to have a global effort which really works and delivers the goods. Now, you've, of course, pinpointed the problem. How do you bring people along on this? And maybe hearing me is not the way to do it. But I think what people are going to realize is that when they see that the cost per kilowatt hour of energy generated from renewables is actually much, much less than the cost per kilowatt hour of energy generated from fossil fuel sources, and that is then reflected in their household bills, then they will begin to come along. But there's, of course, you've got a long way to get there.
Now, given that you're such a champion of biodiversity, I assume that you've been advising your son to leave the newts alone and not build a swimming pool.
You know, that's so funny. I was actually responsible, I really was, when I was in the EU, of drafting the Habitats Directive. And yes, of course, the great crested newt was one of the great.
So he's been kiboshed by his own father.
Easy. Well, as I recall, there's a moat he can swim in as well. But anyway, coming back to the great crested newt. Let's be clear about this. Why was the great crested newt on the list of the Habitats Directive? It was because taking Europe as a whole, taking the biogeographical extent of Europe as a whole, the great crested newt was very, very, very rare, and it happened to be actually prevalent mainly, if not only, in this country, which is part, whether Brexiteers like it or not, of the geographical landmass, which is Europe.
Yes.
And so it was on our list in the same way, by the way. The Spanish lynx is on the list. Now, you could say, oh, well, why are the Spanish having to try and protect all the lynxes, and why are Britain interested? Because these are, in a sense, part of our common heritage. We are as keen, I think, to see the lynx protected in Spain as the Spanish would be to see the great crested newt protected in Britain, because it's all part of our heritage.
Well, indeed. And the great crested newt exists only in Britain, rather like Brexiteers. Maybe they should be protected as well from the EU and its overreaching powers of economy. And finally, been great to talk to you, Stanley. What advice would you have for Boris if they do try and persuade him to go into the jungle? You've been there. Should he go?
Well, I very much enjoyed it. I can't tell you, for me, the joy of actually sitting in this quote-unquote jungle, which is a rather lovely part of the Australian rainforest, and having nothing to do, because you can't take pen, you can't take paper, you can't take music. All you can do is contemplate your thoughts, your navel, and have wonderful conversations with people like Toff or Becky Vardy or Dennis Lomax. I mean, or Jenny McAlpine. I can't tell you what a joy it was. And I am absolutely sure, will have as much fun as I did.
Yeah, absolutely right. Stanley, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Stanley Johnson there telling us why he needs politicians to be better at persuading the people to go net zero.